Hey folks, we're just going to get started. My name is Ishani Weera, and I'm an organizer at the Alberta Federation of Labor, and co-workers at the back. And I'm really happy to be here. Oh, that sounds so much better. We're good? Okay. And so we're here to talk about the geopolitics of the oil industry, and we have two phenomenal speakers. We will have Laura Benny joining us from Skype, but to start things off, we have Anna Zalik here. And I just want to tell you a little bit about how things will work. We'll have our speakers speak, and then I'll moderate the Q&A, and I just want to put in your minds, in terms of participating in the Q&A, as you know, Parkland is a community-based organization, and we certainly want to open up the discussion, but also be mindful of encouraging participation from marginalized folks and people that might not necessarily come up to a mic. So just please be mindful of your privileges while you're in the room, and think about stepping forward and stepping back so that we can all participate in the discussion. So we're going to be starting with Anna, and I'll just tell you a little bit about her, though I'm sure many of you know about her work. Anna is a faculty member at York University in Environmental Studies. Her research concerns the political economy and sociology of the oil and gas industry, with a focus on cases from Nigeria, Mexico, and Canada. Along with her colleagues, she's currently engaged in a multi-year project concerning the regulation of Canadian oil and gas frontiers and democracy and transparency in the Nigerian oil industry. We're really happy that she could join us here, and I'll let you just take the stage.
So first of all, I'm very honored to be here and to be back at the university where I did my undergraduate degree and spent many years. And there's many people in the audience that I've learned a lot from, some 20 years ago and some in the last couple of years. So I expect you to correct all errors that may come out of this talk. There's all generations here that could correct those errors, so I appreciate that. And I'll say just a little bit about how I came to do research on the oil and gas industry, because when I started my doctorate in 2000, I didn't actually intend to study the oil and gas industry. I was interested in private aid, and part of my interest in that had actually been inspired by some work in Wetaskiwin through an exchange program that was co-organized through Augustana University College and the State University of Morelos in Mexico. And Canada World Youth was involved in that exchange. And during that contract, I still have a very clear memory of being in the youth center in Wetaskiwin and having a couple of the youth workers complain about the fact that they now had to use this language around assets when assessing whether or not their projects had been successful. So it was this whole kind of penetration of market-based language into the social projects at that youth center. And later, I was working with a community-based organization in Mexico that was receiving a lot of funds from private foundations. And so I decided that what I wanted to study was the way in which private money was reshaping the activities of social movements through sort of NGOization, I guess you could say, and selected cases in Mexico and Nigeria because the Ford Foundation and the MacArthur Foundation had very long histories in both regions, and I had had a background in partially in African history and politics from here at the University of Alberta, and had been working in Mexico prior. So I'm going to just sort of place this in the context of a recent experience in Fort McMurray, the Shell Jackpine mine expansion hearings that Ariel Deranger just described, the sort of hypocrisy of the consultation process very well in the previous session. And I have been studying Shell in part because of their long history in Nigeria, which is well known. And in 2010, I published an article about the way in which Shell's scenarios publications were potentially influencing the way the oil and gas market was working. And at the Shell Jackpine mine expansion hearings in Fort McMurray, Shell distributed a pamphlet that uses some of the same material that is part of their scenarios publications to demonstrate that even in 2050, fossil fuels and nuclear will supply 70% of the world's energy needs, and 30% will be renewables. Now, this is Shell's imagination of the future. This doesn't have to be anyone else's. And by sort of producing this kind of documentation that's based on their forecasting, it becomes part of the way in which other people operate in the oil market, and which I consider to be pretty problematic. So when I published this piece in 2010, the day that it went up on the internet of the website of the journal, so it hadn't come out in print yet, I got an email from a former staff member of Shell Scenarios programs, who explained all of his different connections to me, including the fact that he had done a master's in environmental studies at York University, that he had an office down the hall from somebody I went to grad school with, and that he had worked at Shell Scenarios division in a certain period of time. He then took exception in sort of an odd way to various aspects of the article, and it took me a couple of years to figure out why he took so much exception to that, but I won't go into that right now. But he told me to read another book. And the book is by a woman named Mia de Kuiper, who wrote a book called Profit, Power, and Economics. And she describes herself as a global business strategist. She's the dean of the Duisenberg School of Finance in Amsterdam and a former Shell executive. Now, in her book, she talks about how we're entering a period of perfect transparency. Now, you need to go through this book carefully, because on page 42, and believe me, it doesn't come up if you're just flipping through, she describes her use of the word transparency. My use of the word transparency is meant to emphasize the fact that information will travel instantly and without obstruction, equally clear and perceptible to everyone. I am not describing the sort of transparency that is demanded when critics insist that windows into business or government operations be held open in order to enforce accountability. So to me, this kind of says it all, really. I could sit down, but I'll continue a bit, because I think this is sort of what we're dealing with, right? There's this whole industry spin that anybody who lives in Alberta is very familiar with. And there was actually one other Alberta story that I felt I should tell, which is that I feel frequently in Ontario like a defensive Albertan, because there's so much critique of Alberta, and I don't think it's warranted. And, I know this community, and I so admire the work of the Parkland Institute, and I think, how can you say this about Alberta? So, but I also feel sort of some guilt, because 1993, which is the year that I finished my undergraduate degree here, was the first year that Ralph Klein was elected. And in that election, the Tories did not get more than 50% of the popular vote. The NDP lost all their seats, but the Tories still had like 44% of the popular vote. So this, to me, demonstrates that Alberta, there's more than 50% of the population did not support the Ralph Klein agenda, and now fewer and fewer people are voting in every election, perhaps because we need electoral reform, something else to consider here. But in Ontario, there's actually very little understanding of this. There's this perception that actually everyone in Alberta agrees with the status quo. So with regard to this transparency issue, Myself and a graduate student, Kimia Gormeshi, have put in some access to information and privacy requests inspired by Gail, who's had very interesting experiences doing such things, with regard to the activities of Export Development Canada. And initially, we were looking into Export Development Canada because in conjunction with colleagues in Nigeria, we wanted to understand what was really going on in terms of Canadian investment into West Africa, as well as Canadian mining monies being subsidized through Export Development Canada. But what we came across when looking at the EDC website was that, in fact, there were funds going to Enbridge and TransCanada from Export Development Canada, which struck us as extremely problematic. So we put an ATIP request that yielded very little information. And what we found out is that basically because EDC acts like a bank, there's no reason why they have to disclose anything that is privileged from the perspective of corporate marketing, and that contains trade secrets or financial, commercial, scientific, or technical information. But what we do know is that Export Development Canada has supported the Keystone Pipeline within a range somewhere between, and this is what they have on their website, and we've requested more detail, and they won't provide it, between $100 and $250 million. So that's a very big range. So clearly there are funds going to subsidize what is considered sort of risky investments directly from a government hands or arm's length agency. Now, in contrast to this sort of murky bit of very little information that we're able to get from Export Development Canada, there are agencies that try to determine how much smuggled oil and various other commodities are out there. And so there's a group called Havoc Scope that I think basically gathers all of their data from the media and other kinds of sources. But they assume that gas and oil smuggling is worth about $53 million. Now, I'll talk about this later because most of it is in Nigeria, but I just want to put this, or 53 billion, excuse me, put this in the context of the fact that the actual information that we're able to get on legitimate investment into the oil and gas industry is extremely limited. So the title of this talk is inspired in part by a report that was put out by Oil Change International and Greenpeace, authored by somebody named Lawrence Stockman last year, in which they demonstrate that all of the international oil companies are replacing their reserves that were in conventional oil with unconventional sources. And this particular report focuses on the tar sands and on the deep offshore. And I won't talk too much about the tar sands because that's been covered at length by a lot of specialists here. But it may be interesting to look at for various people in the room. But one of the things that they demonstrate specifically with regard to the deep water, and that's sort of what I'm going to talk about today, and a little bit more empirical description in terms of the Mexican and Nigerian context, is that Total, British Petroleum, Chevron, Shell, ExxonMobil, ConocoPhillips, which I just learned owns the next door lecture hall, this demonstrates the percentage of their investment in this area. And so this is the way they describe Chevron specifically. The increasing role of deepwater production in Chevron's portfolio could hardly be clearer. Its growth rate will be some 800% greater than the overall growth rate of its production. In ExxonMobil's case, it is a more modest 144%. So, what this is demonstrating is the extent to which areas that are external to the immediate sort of coastal view, and this was, I think, described actually also, I think, by Gail in her talk, the extent to which we cannot actually physically see unless we travel out there, these deep-water installations, they're beginning to be a much larger part all the time of the activities of the international oil companies. So, back to the particular cases. Now, this is, I think, probably pretty well known for people here. But in recent years, Mexico, Saudi Arabia, and Nigeria have just sort of trailed Canada in terms of being major exporters of oil to the United States. And of course, there's been a lot of very important work done by Parkland and Pembina Institute and other groups about the fact that so much of our oil is exported, and people like Gordon Laxer and Larry Pratt have talked about the dynamics in NAFTA, for instance, that kind of make this an imperative that may require us to continue to export regardless of what terms we might want to set for our own natural resource production. So I'm going to come back to this a bit later as well, but what I'm trying to demonstrate here is that there's a lot of talk in the last couple of years about contraband oil markets. Now in Nigeria, there's been sort of much discussion about this for various decades, and in Mexico, with the drug war, which I can't go into detail about, this has become an issue in the last few years. So there's a lot of discussion about the fact that there's these illegal markets and people are stealing oil, with not necessarily the contextualization about why this might be happening or how people might actually see this as their own resource that they want to exploit for their own purposes. So, you know, it's a bit up for grabs as to who is stealing what oil, and certainly in the case of the First Nations, the Aboriginal groups, Métis, who are really the owners of the territory and the tar sands, one could, you know, question that whole sort of discursive way of understanding the oil market. So I just want to place, you know, because I think Mexico and Nigeria are important cases, I just want to place them in historical context, because I think sometimes there is a tendency to look at current situation without sort of exploring the specificity in different oil states. And one of the things that I consider to be sort of crucial in the two settings is the different roles that were played by the international oil industry versus a nationalized oil industry in the development of the post-colonial state. So here is, you know, very much the first classic example of the sort of pity advertising, colonial representation, racialized representation of Africa that became sort of standard in much of the way in which the non-governmental organizations have represented the region, and it was from a 1968 cover of Life magazine during the Nigerian Civil War. And that setting is historically sort of specific because it led to the mushrooming of the NGO sector. People remember seeing these images of that particular incident, the Nigerian Civil War, and what was not covered at the time was the extent to which that was actually a post-colonial power conflict over whether it would be France or Britain who would control the oil fields in the Niger Delta. So that civil war needs to be put in sort of its colonial context. Now, in contrast, in Mexico, what I think sometimes isn't discussed as much as it warrants is the fact that Mexico actually expropriated, kicked out the foreign oil companies in 1938 as an extension of the 1917 revolution. And there was a mass mobilization in support of this. The major transnationals, what today would be Shell and Exxon, were expropriated. There's a lot of debate as to why Britain and the US let this happen, but one of the explanations is that for the US at that point, Britain had more reserves in Mexico than they did, and since they kind of wanted the sun to set on the British Empire and it was the eve of World War II, they sort of let this happen. But what the subsequent decades demonstrated was that it was in fact possible to reinvest the oil revenue in furthering a manufacturing base that was more diverse. Now, in recent years, the Mexican oil industry has been denationalized sort of through creeping privatization, of which has been to which there's been a lot of resistance. But one of the sort of aspects of the denationalization was this call about efficiency. Pemex employs 10 times more workers per barrel than any other oil company in the world. And I was thinking, I think it was Gordon Laxer's talk in the morning, this is described as inefficient. This also means that far more people have jobs, that more of the resources are redistributed and reinvested. Now, sorry? Since sort of the neoliberal onslaught, there's been a movement, of course, with the movement to the offshore, to further privatizing the Mexican oil industry as much as possible. And one of the things that has happened is the entry of different kinds of production sharing contracts, particularly in the deep offshore. So the regions, the deep offshore regions that I'm discussing then, just in case, just so you could sort of see, I don't know if there's a light on this, but on the top right, there's West Africa, and the area where you see a lot of black dots is Nigeria. And this is International Maritime Organization representation of acts of piracy. In the bottom left corner, there is a map of South America, the Gulf of Mexico. And these maps are a bit old, but the most recent ones produced provide almost identical representation of these areas, is portrayed as relatively secure. And so until the last few years, with the changing context in Mexico, the Mexican oil industry was seen as sort of a secure input into fossil America and sort of the ability of the US to reproduce itself. Whereas the context in West Africa, Nigeria specifically, has been associated with volatility in the oil market, so that any time there would be a description of some sort of political action or protest or bombing of a facility in the Niger Delta, the price of oil would go up. And this was, I haven't actually mapped this, but it was definitely, the Financial Times would say prices of oil go up on reports of violence in Nigeria. So this is, part of a dynamic in which one area sort of fuels rising prices, another area is a secure source, and those rising prices that come out of the perception of the Middle East as being very insecure have been one of the factors that has enabled the development, the intensive development of the tar sands. So it's sort of this global constitution of the industry. So in response to the possibility of there being any kind of insecurity arising in the Gulf of Mexico and the Mexican source portion of it, a few years after 9/11, a new code was put into place to guarantee port security. And one of the portions of this code was implemented in Mexico in a way that it has not been implemented on the US side of the Gulf of Mexico, which excludes fishermen from the areas around the platforms. Now, previously, people would go to these areas because they function as sort of artificial reefs. But as a result of the changing sort of political dynamic and fear that some fishermen could be, seeking to sabotage a facility, they were excluded from those areas. And one of the ways that this was addressed was through a particular fund called FIFO Pesca, which is a fund to finance the conversion of the fishery, as there you see sort of boats that aren't being used, into fish farming. So it's changing the whole lifestyle around the fishing sector that many people have described as kind of anti-capitalist, because it doesn't, you set your own workday, you fish what you want, and so on, into a model where they have to be standing there, getting just like a wage laborer in front of a space where they're monitoring a fish farm. And the dynamics around this most recently, in January of this year, led to the signing of a transboundary agreement between Mexico and the United States with regard to areas that jut upon their international boundaries. So I'm going to sort of describe the international boundaries second, but in Mexico, on one side, this particular little cartoon, has sort of stereotype representation of the campesino with his pants down, saying, "So now what do we give to the Yankees? What do we have left to give them?" And with the signing of this particular accord, because the oil sector in Mexico, because of the broad social movement to nationalize it and to expropriate the foreign companies, is a real sort of source of kind of anti-imperialist pride, even among people whose politics aren't necessarily that left, but they kind of have this nationalist streak, and so they don't want to see Mexican oil being given away. So just to sort of describe this area, the area between the black and the red is known as the Western Gap. And in Spanish, there's an economist at the National University of Mexico named Fabio Barbosa Cano, who's done quite a bit of work on the dynamics around the offshore petroleum sector. And he refers to these regions as the donut holes. And so in Mexican discussion for some decades, there's been a concern that the oil in this area that's beyond the coastal delimitation, the 200-mile boundary of Mexico and the US, was in fact being sucked out by a straw. Like a straw, okay? So that because of the fact that there would be intensive development offshore on the US side of the boundary, this was creating this effect where the oil was kind of moving to the US side. Because of all of the sort of tensions around where one would be able to exploit along the area where the Mexican and the US boundaries are next to one another, there had been a moratorium on further development in these areas that was, I think, going to expire next year in 2014. So by signing this accord, that moratorium then was no longer in effect. And so it creates the ground for joint exploitation between the US and Mexico of this area, which is seen as sort of the kind of final act of ceding resource sovereignty by many Mexicans to the Americans. Now, there's also a particular, I think I have this in the next slide. Okay, maybe it's not. But anyways, I'll explain to you. There's also sort of another, I won't say it's a myth because many people say that's quite accurate, another sort of piece of information that circulates in the Mexican context about a disappearing island named Bermeja, the island of Bermeja, which, according to various Mexican historians, appeared on maps into the late 1800s, even early 1900s. And if this island was still visible, you would actually see an extension of Mexico's coastal waters into the zone that is considered no man's land. So there's this sense that somehow this island disappeared, right? It was blown up or who knows what. But the disappearance of this island changed sort of the territorial extension of Mexico in the deep water. And so, as is now being studied in greater depth, all of these sort of debates about who controls the Arctic and other contested zones are around this notion of how far does national sovereignty go into the ocean. So what you see here is both the Western Gap and the Eastern Gap. So I described the Western Gap. There's also a gap on the eastern side, but I think at the moment those reserves are considered sort of inexploitable because of the depths. So they're so deep that we don't have the technology yet. Now, this is, of course, a very strategic region, and I have to say I was absolutely stunned to find this particular map available on the website for the US Coast Guard. So this kind of information on the US portion of the Gulf of Mexico would not be readily available. That is, which particular companies control which lease areas. But somehow the US Coast Guard has this information for Cuba, which I was very surprised. So there you go. One can see that the Cuban offshore oil and gas industry is in the process of being developed. And of course, this, less so under this government, but certainly under previous governments, has been a source of sort of strategic concern. And ever since the Deepwater Horizon blowout, there's been this sort of Caribbean initiative for safety around the oil and gas industry. And Cuba is clearly one of the actors in that. So there's this attempt to find some sort of transnational cooperation about the securing of this region. Now, the securing of that region is parallel in some respects to the securing of the Gulf of Guinea, which is the zone off the coast of Nigeria that encompasses, depending on how you read it, 8 to 15 states, that has also been intensively developed over the last few years. And this particular photo is of so-called bunkered oil, or oil coming from illegal refineries. So sites in southern Nigeria where communities have set up their own refining systems so that they can sell fuel locally at a decent price to their neighbors. That's a sort of romanticized description of it because there are, clearly dangers and problems associated with that. But the bunkering trade, as it's understood internationally, incorporates a series of very different activities. And so these small-scale or illegal refineries are basically selling fuel locally, whereas there's also huge quantities of bunkered contraband oil that are sold in the spot markets in Rotterdam, and in which there has to be upper-level oil industry people and government collusion. Now, these sort of refineries in the Delta are facilitated by the fact that the crude that's produced in Nigeria is considered very high quality. It's a very light crude, so it doesn't really need much refining. This would clearly not be that feasible in the tar sands. Now, the representation of this has become sort of central to reconfiguring the Gulf of Guinea, and so there's been a lot of international activity in the policing and militarization of that zone, as well as in the sort of supposed taking of ecological inventories of the region. And on the sort of your bottom right is the standard, basically racist representation of the insurgency movement, and on the left, a picture of one of these refineries. And this goes hand in hand with a set of policies, laws that were passed in Nigeria concerning compensation in the case of spills. So there is an ongoing debate between various environmental justice groups in Nigeria and the oil companies, Shell being a major one on this particular issue, with regard to how many spills result from sabotage and how many spills result from old pipes. And there's been many cases where it's been demonstrated that the oil industry had tried to dissimulate that the spills actually resulted from sabotage when, in fact, the pipes were rusty. So this, I think, is sort of instructive for what's going on in the tar sands, because if we think 40 years ahead, we'll be seeing, further older infrastructure and a context in which it becomes more difficult to monitor, especially given that the proper baseline information has never been collected. So I'll sort of skip this one, but what this, I think, is, for me, what's an important kind of story from a lot of the dynamics around the offshore is that the move to the offshore is seen by the oil industry as being a safer site of investment, replacing old reserves. Certainly in West Africa, it's seen as being less politically contentious because people can't just go in and shut down a flow station, as Professor Turner has done a lot of work on women's movements doing precisely that. Now, the inability to sort of take a boat out and shut down an offshore installation means that from the perspective of sort of social resistance, these areas are more protected. But as this has been going on, those deep offshore leases are associated with even deeper privatization in terms of the royalties, or royalties is actually the wrong word, the cut of the production that the international oil companies take, even in a context of sort of nationalized industries. And so what's been going on simultaneously to this movement to the offshore is actually the cutting of subsidies and the removal of labor protections in both Mexico and Nigeria. So these pictures are just from the last couple of years. In one case, from what has been sometimes called Occupy Nigeria, which was a huge uprising against the cutting of fuel subsidies in January of this year. And on the Mexican side, the dynamics specifically around the cutting of 44,000 jobs of electrical workers with a move towards privatizing electricity supplies. So maybe it seems as if certain kinds of onshore resistance is decreasing, but the broader implications of further privatization of the industry are negative. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Anna, for that. I would also just like to share regrets from Professor Benny, who unfortunately won't be able to join us today, which is too bad, but hopefully that'll give us a chance for some really rich participatory discussion. So with that, if you could just kind of give me a show of hands, and I will, do we have Sarah, our mic runner? There she is. So we'll just start the discussion part. Sarah, we've just got a question over here. Do you have a mic? Okay. Oh, there we go. Okay.
Thank you very much, Anna, for that. So it was very interesting. Just the tail end of your presentation, there struck me as there seems to be parallels with the offshore industry development in Newfoundland and Labrador. And I think I saw you there for that session this afternoon with Dr. Angela Carter. Do you see any parallels between the sort of offshore industry that was described as a helicopter industry in Newfoundland and Labrador, and the offshore industry in Mexico and the Nigeria situation?
Well, I think Angela might be a better place to answer that question. I mean, because I haven't looked at the labor dynamics there, but I think clearly, there's the potential for things going in that direction. But I don't have the expertise to be able to answer that properly, so I won't try. I think it's something to be examined, and we have lots of time to do that over the next few years.
Over here at the back.
I found that very interesting, Anna. My question is about the contraband oil market. I had no idea it was so vast. I know in the United States there's been a hot oil market, since the 1930s in East Texas, that the government actually brought in the military to stop it. How extensive is this contraband market in North America today?
Well, in the Mexican context, I can give you some figures for the way. There's actually a breakdown. Now, this is Havoc Scope's data. So this is data that they're deriving from a series of sort of journalistic sources. So it's not as if this is necessarily accurate. But they provide a breakdown that puts the Nigerian gas and oil smuggling market at about $24.64 billion. I guess when you're dealing with billions of dollars, the decimal points matter. The United States at $10 billion, Iraq at $5 billion, Mexico at $3 billion. Now, and then it proceeds down, Greece, Turkey, Iran, the Philippines. Canada isn't on the list. But, there's also, I think, interests at play in describing those markets, because clearly the larger the contraband market, the more private security one needs to police legitimate trade. And I imagine that one of the key sort of clients for groups like Havoc Scope are insurance providers and things like that. So in Nigeria, there's been a wide range of estimates from between 150,000 barrels a day that's lost to bunkering to 300,000 barrels a day that's lost to bunkering, and certainly a lot of contestation. So for instance, my colleague Asumi Asuoka, who's with an organization called Social Action in Nigeria, they have been doing reporting on sort of the so-called illegal, what they're calling artisanal refining, as opposed to illegal refining. I think they're trying to point out that this is sort of being used to some extent as a cover for the fact that the transnationals have not cleaned up after now going on for 20 years of criticism. Gas flaring has not stopped. Every year there's sort of an extension on this. There's actually some very interesting WikiLeaks that came out with regard to Shell's US representatives' discussions with either the US or UK embassy about these kinds of questions. 2 years ago, or now it's 1 year ago, the United Nations Environment Program put out a scathing report with regard to the Ogoni area of Nigeria, which demonstrated that Shell had not cleaned up and was not maintaining its own international standards in the region, and talked about a practice that Shell used there that sounds to me a lot like end pit lakes, called RENA, which is remediation by enhanced natural attenuation. So you can imagine what that means, right? It's sort of this, somehow nature will clean up the mess that we left, 300 years from now or whatever.
We've got one more question there. Hi. At the beginning of your talk, I heard you talk about how NGOs in general are becoming a little bit more reliant on privatized money and corporate funds, and this is definitely a problem that's happening. So I'm wondering if you've done any research on how that's affecting NGOs working within these countries and their effect on maybe people mobilizing against oil and gas.
Yeah, I mean, that was the sort of, in a sense, partially the focus of my doctoral work. But what it ended up looking at is the way in which the difference between when the money comes through an international, transnational private oil company or from a parastatal. And in the context of a parastatal, my own argument is basically that there is greater accountability on the part of Pemex to stakeholders, including social movements. What's definitely been the case with regard to NGOs in Nigeria, the description that was given was that after the execution of Ken Saro-Wiwa in 1995, Shell sought to reinvent its image, right, as the leader in corporate social responsibility. So they set up this very big community development branch, and that branch hired out of all of the big NGOs, and the term that was used by somebody was that the NGO sector had been shelled. So they basically, hired all of the leading staff. But it's a difficult situation because now the NGOs and the community itself, it's like a form of colonialism, right? So those that accept funds are seen differently than those that don't, and it breeds distrust. Certainly in the context, in the Nigerian setting, the companies have funded communities, and this is similar in some respects to impact benefit agreements in Canada's north, without telling others who they funded, which has led to a lot of violence in the region. That could be an entire sort of lecture to itself, but I think it's a big problem at the university I teach at. We just got this information about the Imperial Oil Research Awards, and it directly said that this was research in the interest of Imperial Oil. Now, I would have thought this was against the principles of the university to accept such an award, but actually it's being facilitated through the research office. So this left us some of us who work on this stuff, a bit surprised. So I think it's a problem everywhere where there's oil money.
Hello, I'm just wondering if anyone read the book called Backstabbing for Beginners. It's about this naive young fellow that gets a dream job in the UN, and it was at the time they had the oil embargo on Iraq, and boy, he was so disillusioned. The officials of the United Nations and All the big oil companies were skirting that embargo, and they were making millions and millions of dollars. Even Kofi Annan, the Secretary General, his son was involved in it. And when somebody mentioned Total in the other lecture, they were one of the worst ones, Total Oil from France. It just blew my mind, this book. And this poor fellow, he was a young guy, and he always wanted to work for the UN, and he was completely disillusioned. And the head of that oil embargo, Food for Oil, or wherever it was in the UN, he was one of the worst ones.
I should read it for backstabbing for a bit.
Yeah, it's on. Is it on? Oh, yeah, sorry. I'm trying to get my head around the smuggling of oil. How could that possibly take place without a lot of collaboration going on?
You answered it. Yeah. There's an organization in Nigeria called legaloil.com, which seeks to track the dynamics around the smuggling trade. I find its work quite problematic, but one of the things that is now well known is that upper-level military, and of course, it's military of different stripes that would have been associated with this trade. But I mean, it's a multi-million-dollar, billion-dollar trade that goes through spot markets. So I think there's also a bit of a blurriness, right, between what is licit and what is illicit oil, even from the perspective of people who operate in those markets. And what they proposed, what legaloil.com proposed, was fingerprinting the oil, like putting some sort of chemical additive. They were trying to compare the oil to conflict diamonds, which I felt, which I consider sort of sketchy.
We've got a question here, and then one at the back there. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, we're just going to switch up the order. We'll take Dave, and then here, and then back there. And I see you, Doug.
Hi, Anna. You mentioned your research on Shell's scenarios and how it can manipulate oil markets. We've also been hearing about the IEA this weekend at the conference. I was wondering if you could speak to the role of the IEA.
Okay. Thanks, Dave. I had actually was rereading an article by Mazen Laban, looking at the International Energy Agency's scenarios, publications, the World Energy Outlook. And so I think Andrew Nikiforuk talked about this a bit. The IEA is sort of seen as the International Energy Agency is sort of the counterweight to OPEC. So it sort of represents the OECD countries that import oil from OPEC states. Now, various people, including Nitzan and Bichler, Jonathan Nitzan is a professor at York, have demonstrated that basically OPEC's interests are actually very similar to the international oil companies in terms of oil prices. This wasn't necessarily the case at the time of OPEC's nationalizations of the industry, and one could see that as having been seeking resource sovereignty by countries, former colonized countries, against the global north. But interestingly, Keith Stewart from Greenpeace at these Jackpine hearings used the International Energy Agency's most recent report to demonstrate that if the tar sands were developed, we would be way above the CO2 limits for being within the 2-degree warming area. So the IEA itself has sort of taken on the role of calling for the extension of the carbon market in the interests, supposedly, of CO2 mitigation. That in itself has its own problems, because there are many people who would say that all of the so-called offsets are sort of meaningless, that they don't amount to actual reduction of CO2 emissions, and the only way to do that is to stop producing oil, right? And to leave the oil in the soil. In Ecuador, the Acción Ecológica was part of a movement to call for, prevent development of a particular region called Yasuni, with the objective that this would be one way prevent CO2 emissions. And of course, one could have a similar movement in Alberta seeking some sort of compensation at the international level for a moratorium on approvals. I don't know how that would go over, but in any case, Mazen's thing on the World Energy Outlook, his argument was that in their reports, they were trying to describe energy poverty as being around the extension of electricity. And basically what they were trying to promote through, I think, the 2010 scenarios was a context in which private electrification of rural areas in the global south was sort of the answer to poverty. And he takes exception to this as, because one of the things they also promote is the end to fuel subsidies, as per what happened in Nigeria. So the end to fuel subsidies was one way, to protect poor populations from a volatility in the oil market, and the end to those is, classic neoliberal policy that hurts the people who can least afford it.
Okay, so we have no, you're fine. We have 3 more questions. So just one here, and I had one in the back, and then Doug up here, and then we'll just wrap things up. Go right ahead.
Anna, you started out talking about the Jackpine extension, and I think the audience would be quite interested to hear what your take is on Shell's activities in Nigeria and how they may be applied to northern Alberta.
Okay. So last week when I was preparing for these hearings, I sort of consulted Gail and Angela about what can I say about the results of our research, right? And Angela was like, be sure to point out the irony of the fact that the week before the opening of these hearings on the Jackpine mine extension, Shell had bought the naming rights for the extension of the facility where the hearings were being held. Now, at the University of Alberta, people just kind of roll their eyes because it's not as if this is sort of new here. But it was so, coincidental that this happened literally the Thursday before the Monday or Tuesday when the hearings were starting. And so as you drove into this sportsplex, there was now a big sign, huge billboard that said, "Welcome to Shell Place." And then you went up the stairs to, I think, past the Suncor room to the region, to the place where the hearings were being held. Now, one of the things that happened during those hearings, so there were a couple of weird power outages, and somebody else, I don't know if Diana Gibson's in the audience, but she was telling me a similar kind of dynamic. There were a couple of power outages that affected when Athabasca Chippewa First Nation, that's opposing the project, when their elders would have to be available for their panel, right? Because they kept changing the schedule, which of course involves more costs for the people who are opposing the project, who clearly have, a tiny proportion of the resources available to them that Shell does. In addition to the power, so there were 2 fire alarms and a power outage. Now the power outage went on for 4 hours, and it affected the entire Fort McMurray. So I'm not claiming that this was associated with the hearings. But we came back at 1 o'clock. I was with some people from ACFN to the site, and the hearings were starting at 2, and they wouldn't let us in to the sports complex. And there were a group of elders from ACFN with this group. 5 minutes later, the bus with all of the 25 people in the Shell panel pulls up, and they're allowed into the facility. So I texted this to Asumio Soka, with whom I had submitted something to present evidence at this hearings, and his response was, even in Canada. This was sort of classic for the kinds of things that would be expected in the Nigerian setting. So anyways, luckily this was a relatively warm day. I think it was like 4 above or something. But the people did have to wait outside for an hour, and the Shell people went straight in to the building. And so it's just, Now, there were various other moments of misrepresentation. So there's a professor here at University of Alberta, Colleen Cassidy St. Clair, who manages a bird monitoring program. And at one point, one of Shell's witnesses was describing how they participate actively in this bird monitoring program with U of A scientists. So, I was in the audience, so I could look up the actual report from this monitoring program, and one of the key recommendation or finding from the monitoring program from last year was that the independent University of Alberta researchers had encountered 5 times as many cases of bird landings than the oil industry. So they were sort of presenting it as we're collaborating with these researchers, but the main recommendation of this report is we need to find out why there's so much inter-observer variation. So, you know, and the list goes on. There were many of these examples from those hearings that Ariel could speak to better.
And just to wrap things up, we're just going to do both of our last 2 questions, and then I'll give Anna a chance to answer each of them. So, Sarah, where are you? Doug here. So I'll get your question and yours, and then we'll just have the discussion.
Thank you very much for the engaging and interesting talk. My question is about the pipeline bombings or resistance. I'm not quite sure what to call the idea that local communities are taking the oil for their own purposes, refining it and using it and selling it. And I'm interested in the idea that this is an act of resistance to the oil companies from potentially their environmental degradation, and also potentially as a way to actually live and get some of the benefits of the oil. And my tie into this is actually related to the previous question. How would you see this in relation to what potentially is going to happen in northern BC and northern Alberta with all the pipelines that are planned there? Do you think that there's some parallels there? Could you potentially comment on that?
And then Doug, if we could just get your question as well.
So thank you very much for the very interesting talk. I had the privilege of visiting Nigeria earlier this year and concur with what you say. But in doing my reading, I was reading sort of another definition of transparency. So the Jonathan Goodluck government of Nigeria, in the name of transparency, admits that there's $180 million a month that goes missing from what the oil companies remit as royalties and what shows up on the government account books. Amazing. But my question is that in looking at the maps for the development of the offshore and in the Gulf of Guinea that you provided there, it looks to me like there is no such thing as peak oil for our lifetime, or perhaps the lifetime of humans on the planet. Are they just going to keep on going till it's all burned up?
Well, okay, so I'll kind of move backwards. So these deep offshore reserves and tar sands are considered within unconventional sources, so they're sort of post-peak sources. But I agree with you that I think that a lot of the discourse around peak oil has been about talking about how we were running out of oil, when in fact we're just running out of certain kinds of oil that are, as I think Andrew Nikiforuk and others pointed out, are less expensive to produce and less energy intensive to produce. So the issue is, of course, it's in the oil industry's interest, in the interests of people who develop the technologies, to continue to try and source in all of these locations. And it takes a concerted effort, of which there is one, and this sort of leads into the other question, to prevent the expansion of that economy. I mean, you think the Nigerian context, the figures that you described from the Jonathan government, when he was elected, this was seen in the Niger Delta as a very positive thing because he's from the region. And now various people are disillusioned with that, but this is sort of embedded in a deep history of the oil industry's sort of operating procedures for years. There's certain I'm not saying that the scale is the same, but there's also other ways in which similar kinds of golden handshakes are delivered to various kinds of operatives in the Albertan context in terms of the revolving door between industry and the regulators, right? So it comes in different forms. With regard to the pipelines, I can't speak for whether people who are, well, I've heard people who, in interviews, who are involved with illegal refineries describe this as kind of a direct form of resource control. But I think the problem is that after 50, 60 years of development of the oil industry in Nigeria, there's sort of no way out, right? So in a context where much of the local youth have been unable to get good jobs in industry. This is sort of an alternative, what some people would call the sort of economy of social exclusion, where you make a claim on the oil wealth by sort of taking it. I think with regard to the pipeline struggles here, these to me, there's a big No Line 9 sort of action in Toronto last weekend, and in terms of the reversal of the Line 9 pipeline. And this is, these movements are very important because once those pipelines, once the investment in the pipelines are built, then there's huge interest in keeping the production going to fill the pipelines. Refineries are supposedly already at overcapacity kind of globally, but if you stop the pipelines, then that's an important factor in stopping the flow, or just reducing the flow. And I think in this room there's probably a lot of differing opinion as to whether or not you want to stop it or reduce it. But even if you don't want to stop it and you just want to keep it at the current levels, installing the Keystone or any other, or the Northern Gateway pipeline to the coast will propel further approvals. Thanks, Susanna.
Anna, I just want to thank you for being so generous with your time. I know you didn't expect to speak for so long, but I think we all benefited from it, and it was a great cap to the day.